people are still joining, just a couple of minutes before we get started. You've probably noticed by now that your line is muted. And that's to provide the best listening experience for all of our participants. We'll get started with the presentation in just another minute. Want to get started?
All right, yeah, let's get started.
All right, very good. So welcome again to everyone who's here participating with us on Zoom and on YouTube. You're participating in the Clifton Corridor Transit Initiative conversation with MARTA. My name is Whitney Fuller. I am one of the team members. I'm here to help facilitate the conversation. Before we get started, I'll make you aware of a few housekeeping items for review. If you're participating online on Zoom today, you'll have the opportunity to be a part of the discussion and ask questions throughout the meeting by typing your questions or comment in the chat box. So you can comment in the chat feature as well as raise your hand to alert us that you have a question to ask. The moderator will unmute you and allow you to speak. And that is towards the end of the conversation, the end of the presentation, when we open up the discussion for Q&A. If you happen to be dialed in to participate in the meeting right now, you can use the raise your hand feature by dialing *9 on your cellular device. An operator will come on and let you know that you can unmute yourself and speak. If you happen to have any other technical issues with Zoom or with YouTube today, please be patient with us while we sort that out. If you have any questions or want to dive deeper into the project after this meeting, you can visit the connectclifton.com website for project information and to view a recording of this conversation, as well as review the written responses to any questions that come out of this conversation and other meetings that we've had on this project to date. And if you have any other customer concerns about MARTA services, you can reach out to MARTA directly at the email custserve@itsmarta.com or call 404-848-5000. And one of the team members will support you from there. But we'll go ahead and get started with the conversation. I'll hand things over to our project manager to introduce himself. Brian, take it from here.
Unmute.
All right, yeah.
All right, thank you, Whitney. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us again as we want to relay to you what we've been doing on the project for Clifton Corridor. Just give you an idea of where we're going with the project, as well as to get feedback from you guys. It's going to be very important to get feedback from you as we continue to move this project forward in hopes of adopting a new LPA here fairly soon. So what you see on the screen right here, just to give you an idea of what we will be discussing. Again, learn about the alternative analysis process that we have kicked off here at MARTA with regards to this project, why we are redoing or why we are going back and looking at this project and looking at the alternatives and the modes. We'll get into a little bit of what the Screen 1 entails, so what this process entails, how we're evaluating everything. And then we'll talk about the mode and alternative comparisons. As you know, now we are looking at BRT for this project. So talk a little bit about the difference in the modes that we're looking at with regards to the project, and then get into the next steps and where we're headed in an effort to get to a new LPA so that we can move this project closer to construction. We will have a Q&A session at the end of this, just to give you an opportunity to ask questions, more detailed questions. And we can dive a little bit more into some of the thoughts and things that you may have. So with that, I'll kind of talk a little bit about the project team. I myself, the project manager for MARTA. You can reach out to me at any time through email or through the customer serve, as you saw earlier. Shelly Peart, who's interim AGM planning manager. She may be on now, but she's also part of the team. Greg Jafrida, MARTA Director of Communications and Engagement, Capital Projects. Then you also have Peter Voorhees, who's AECOM project manager, and Content Terry, who is our content consultant for public involvement. So any of these names here you see, if you happen to have a question and reach out, we can get an answer to you fairly quickly. So with that, let's get into the project overview. So a little bit about this project. As we know, it is a high capacity, high transit corridor. So we are proposing high capacity transit service throughout a major employment and institutional corridor. One thing we like to acknowledge in this region is that this is one of the highest employment regions, corridors in the region. So it is very imperative that we get some reliable and efficient transit in this area. So that is part of the community need and purpose. So frequent and reliable transit in a needed to serve the corridor, better transit access and connectivity, as well as improve access to the MARTA rail system. As we know right now, while we do have bus service operating in the corridor, it's not good connectivity at this point, and it also does not connect directly to the MARTA rail system. So these are some things that we're looking at from a purpose and need standpoint for this project, and why we're looking to move it forward. Again, it being one of the highest employment areas in the region in the Southeast, it makes a lot of sense for us to have reliable transit in this area. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the project history. So this project's been studied for a long time. It actually started in 2008. But in 2012, MARTA adopted a locally preferred alternative. Now that was an alternative 7, which actually was a fully bored tunnel light rail system, which is pretty expensive. And it also included an alternative 6, was an above ground option. That above ground option was not utilizing any right of way for CSX. It was all within public right of way. And so that was the locally preferred alternative. And actually that still is the locally preferred alternative. A couple of things that have taken place over the years that has caused us to go back and look at this project. One of those major milestones was the passing of the More MARTA Atlanta program in around 2016, 2017. That gave us an opportunity to have some dedicated funding for this project. So with that, we did go back and take a look at some things early on where we actually in 2018, we actually had an opportunity where we were looking to adopt a new LPA. But again, with the changes in the conditions around the area, we did not move forward with adopting an LPA then. We decided to go back into what we are doing now, which is now an alternative analysis to ensure that we're looking at this project at a holistic standpoint, where we're now looking at BRT and LRT as that technology from a BRT standpoint is now much more reliable. So now we're in 2022 where we're doing this and what we're talking about today. And then in 2023, we will go with the goal of getting a new LPA selected. So a little bit about the process right now and how we're going to evaluate the project alternatives and in multiple stages. So we are looking at this in 2 phases. We're in phase 1 where we're doing the screen evaluation 1. So this is the 10 alternatives that you will see today. So this is phase 1 where we will then, after we get your feedback, look to narrow this thing down to about 3 alternatives. So those 3 alternatives will be phase 2. Now, when we're in phase 2, we will go into more detail from an engineering standpoint and feasibility. Right now, we're very high level from an engineering standpoint, and we're just looking to get feedback on the options and the modes that we're looking to pursue within this corridor. So your feedback is going to be very important. And once we get down to the 3 alternatives, we'll look to narrow that thing down to where we will get to an LPA, one alternative in mode, where we'll look to move forward. We're selecting an LPA by March 2023. So a little bit about what's changed and why we're back here. So BRT being a mode in this region that we do not currently have. It is a mode that is quickly becoming a popular mode because of its quicker implementation, its rail-like quality and features. And it's something that exists using existing vehicle facilities that we currently have, because it's just charging stations when you're talking about electric buses. So that is a reason we're going back now and looking at things. We're also looking at off-wire rail technology. We've been asked to look at this technology because, again, as technology has evolved, this is an opportunity where we could utilize off-wire rail technology. So we can go back and look at that. The CSX corridor being a focus. So previously we were outside of the CSX corridor, as the conversations there were not moving forward. So we've recently had some great conversations with CSX. We're very optimistic right now about the opportunity to work together with CSX and utilize some of their corridor for this project. And so again, that is another major change with this project that now warrants us to go back and look. We're now also considering an East Terminus station at Decatur Station. Now that wasn't previously part of this project, but now we're looking at that because we have to look from a holistic standpoint. If we're going to go back for an alternative analysis and look at different modes and routes, Decatur Stations is very close. So we need to look from a holistic standpoint. Does it make sense to go to Decatur or Avondale? Either way, one thing we want to do is make sure we encompass the entire area and take a look at and see the viability of it. That doesn't mean we're changing, but the viability, we need to make sure that it is not more efficient to go there than Avondale. From corridor changes, the corridor has changed rapidly from 2012. All of the development that is taking place, development from Emory, other stakeholders. It's really important that we go back and look at all of the development and make sure that we can still implement a project within this area, and so that we are not affecting all of the development that is taking place to date. So with that, I kind of get into a little bit about the mode comparison. I kind of talked a little bit about what we're doing now from a standpoint of looking at different modes while we're looking at BRT and LRT at this point. So I want to kind of talk about BRT and what MARTA as an organization considers BRT. So in our mind, BRT is a high capacity transit corridor or mode. It is a high quality transit system. Again, it delivers rail-like qualities. For MARTA, it is important that our BRT system operates exactly like our rail system or in rail-like fashion, because it is a premium service and we want it to be viewed as that. And so all of the amenities, all of the frequencies that we operate on, and all of the infrastructure, it will be to the quality of rail. So look, 10-minute peak frequencies or less, similar to rail is what we call for BRT, dedicated operating lanes. One thing, the federal government requires 50% of dedicated lanes, where at MARTA, we're looking at 70% before we call it BRT. So our threshold is a lot higher than the federal government itself when you start talking about what is BRT. Unique transit line and vehicle branding. All of our BRT lines will be uniquely branded. Again, just like our rail lines. Station amenities. Station amenities are plentiful. This is not just a shelter we're talking about. We're talking about full-on stations, as you can see in some of the pictures here. These are full-on stations with wayfinding, off-boarding ticketed, near level boarding, as well as bike racks and seating maps and things of that nature. So we're talking a full-on station and not just shelters. And then transit signal priority. With our BRT systems, we want to utilize transit signal priority because that allows us to operate efficiently, similar to rail being in our own corridors. Light rail, you guys may know more about light rail for this project than BRT, so I won't spend too much time on it. But similar to our BRT system, as we kind of mentioned, when we're looking at light rail for this corridor, we're looking at 10-minute peak frequencies or less. With light rail, one of the biggest differences than BRT is that there are embedded tracks. So it is a fixed system when we build a light rail system, where BRT is a little bit more nimble. Unique vehicle branding, we definitely will have unique vehicle branding when we're doing light rail. And then the difference between overhead electric wire technology as well as off-wire technology. The off-wire technology, which is newer, gives us a much more pleasing from an aesthetic standpoint when you're going through areas that are very conscientious about the view. And you can see that in a picture here on the bottom right there. So what I want to do now is get a little bit into the alternatives and what we've been doing over the last few months. And so what you're looking at here, as we kind of talked about earlier, is the alternatives. What the alternatives that we're looking at. And what's on the screen right now are the 4 BRT alternatives that we are considering for this corridor. If you look here, the commonality here is that majority of the corridor, we'll say 80%, 80 to 85% of this corridor is somewhere within the CSX right of way. If you can follow my cursor there, you'll see we're still within CSX. So this is for the BRT. We do around Lindbergh, where we're talking the starting point, we will be outside of the CSX corridor. So as you can see here, there are a few areas where we will be in surface streets, so on public right of way. So each of the alternatives do start that way, but then all the alternatives end up within the CSX corridor, following down until we get to North Decatur Claremont. North Decatur Claremont is where we will split. So now you're looking at the Avondale alternative, where we have one with regards to going to Avondale with the BRT system. And then the other 3 are all going towards Decatur Station. Again, when you look at this from a standpoint of this area here and the area around Lindbergh, we're looking from a holistic standpoint of the opportunity in the area to find the most efficient route for the alternative. So next, I will look at the LRT alternatives. So if you look here, we do have 6 of these alternatives. What I will point out is that LRT3, which is the green alternative, that is the current LPA. And you can see the difference here when you're looking onto the map of LRT3, which is the current LPA, and how we are not totally within the CSX corridor. We're actually on Clifton Road in some areas and North Decatur Road. So if you look at this map, majority of the alternatives are going through the CSX corridor. Again, this is the light rail. The only one that does not go through that does not continue on the CSX corridor is the current LPA, which is LRT3 in the green. Again, we end here. We look here at North Decatur Claremont, where we would then split off into whether we go to Avondale or whether we go to Decatur Station. Again, even with light rail, it's a little different here with light rail when we talk about the Lindbergh Center, because now we're talking the connectivity into the current Lindbergh Station, and the access of how we get down into the corridor is a little different. But again, majority of the corridor for most of the alternatives are within the CSX corridor. We get to North Decatur Claremont, we then split off where we now have 3 alternatives going towards Avondale, and then we have 3 alternatives going towards Decatur Station. So these are the alternatives that we're looking at with regards to LRT. So how are we evaluating? What are the key differences to the different corridors and the different modes? One thing I'll kind of point out as we get into this is talk about the criteria and how we're evaluating each of the alternatives. From a project purpose and need, you can see here on the screen that we're looking at everything from alignment length, from travel times, average speed, transit connectivity, multimodal connectivity and considerations, population served, job served, as well as the opportunity for TOD redevelopment. So that's from a purpose and need standpoint. We're evaluating each of these corridors based on this criteria. Then you want to talk about minimizing the impacts to the area. So roadway operations, very important, especially when you're talking about BRT, as well as light rail if you're going down the roadway. Intersection impacts, construction impacts, water resources. As we know, there are a lot of resources in the area from a standpoint of water resources that we will and potentially could affect. Cultural and historic resources, historic neighborhoods, historic buildings, all of these things are things that we're looking at in this process. Noise and vibration, community resources. So from a minimizing impact standpoint, these are the things that we're considering for each corridor when we're looking to see which one is the most efficient and viable. Funding potential, that is very important for, it really doesn't matter the mode at this point. Capital costs is important, operation and maintenance costs, and then avoiding major obstacles. As you know, we don't have an infinite amount of money. So we have to consider funding potential as well as ways to reduce costs and make sure that we do get something that everyone can enjoy and utilize. So that is very important. Maximum support and others. So one thing we do want to make sure is that we have consensus around, or a majority consensus around what we're doing here. So the mode and the alternative, the route that we're pursuing, we want to make sure that you as the public and stakeholders have an opportunity to weigh in, and that we have some consensus around where we're headed with this project. That also includes freight rail impacts. As you know, now we're considering freight rail, CSX right away. And so participation and support from them is very important to move this project forward. This slide here talks a little bit about land use and transit-oriented development. One thing you'll notice quickly is that regardless of the corridor, and this is BRT, regardless of the corridor and the mode right now, honestly, every area that we're looking at, the potential for BRT, for TOD is good or excellent. Right now, we've only located one area, identified one area where we see low potential for a TOD, but really majority of this corridor is great when you start talking about TOD opportunity. And so we are looking at that. We are looking at everything around the stations and how that is going to look. And these are a half-mile radius when we're talking about building a transit mode within the corridor. The next slide here, I want to get a little bit into the comparisons for the terminus. As I mentioned earlier, we are looking at Avondale and Decatur, Avondale being the previous and Decatur being newer. And so this just gives you an idea of what we are seeing right now with regards to each of the terminus station. From the overall takeaways, you can see that more activity centers and development opportunities lie in the Avondale corridor, where we're seeing lower travel times and costs with existing transit-oriented development in the Decatur area. So that's an overall takeaway when you look at comparing the two. From a jobs and equity standpoint, we see the higher population and employment is being touched when you go the Avondale route. But when you do go to Decatur route, you do see a higher share of the population below poverty. So that route does touch that population a lot more. Community resources, if we go towards Avondale, we touch more medical facilities and grocery stores, where we're looking to touch more educational facilities if we go towards the Decatur alternative. And then multimodal connections. Right now, there are more existing and planned transit connections going towards Avondale. Right now, for the Decatur alternative, it's pretty robust in that area already. We only right now see more existing bicycle facilities. And so that gives you an idea of what things look like in the future could look like from a multimodal connection standpoint. This next slide talks about population equity and community resources between the two alternatives. We kind of mentioned some of these in the previous slide, obviously touching more medical facilities and pharmacies and nursing homes when you talk about the Avondale alternatives, where you're looking at more educational facilities going towards Decatur alternatives. But one of the things we did talk about, the populated forecast, when you start talking about the population and employment, obviously being the largest employment area, that is looked to grow by 2040. So we're looking for that to increase. And so the Avondale alternative gives us an opportunity to touch that population as well as grocery stores. Some of the things that we've seen that are equal, it's the share of minority population in the area, regardless of the corridor. You're going down the share of seniors and zero-car households also. Those are about even when you start talking about the different alternative and terminus stations. This next slide talks a little bit about mode comparison. So BRT and LRT, capital costs, which is important when you're talking about building out a major infrastructure project. So if you look right now, what we're estimating right now with BRT, we are at $670 million to $860 million. This is based on the alternative that we choose from BRT. Where LRT right now, we're looking at $2.1 to $3.1 billion. LRT, again, this is based on, it depends on the alignment that we choose. One thing I will say about LRT is that we keep in mind that those costs are a little higher because this is a different operating operating mode that we would have within MARTA. We would have to build a new facility from maintenance standpoint. So that's included in costs, as well as training and more infrastructure is required for LRT. So that's the difference right now when you start looking at the capital costs and the numbers. Where BRT, we already have facilities, as well as we likely will implement, we have charging stations now in some of our facilities. And so those costs really, really glare and come out when you start looking into detail into those. Annual operating costs, obviously, with LRT, it's a lot higher. It's a lot more infrastructure, a lot more required. So we're looking at $14.7 to $28.4 million per year when you're talking about operating. BRT, we're looking right now at $4.5 to $9.5 million per year. Again, each of these are depending on the alternative and the route we select. Travel times, about even. We're looking at 20 to 30 minutes when we're talking BRT from the full corridor standpoint, where we're talking 15 to 26 minutes with LRT. So you can see the travel times are comparable with regards to BRT and LRT. And then implementation time frame, which is something that's very important. Do you want something now or do you want something later? Right now, we're looking at 5 to 7 years with regards to BRT and getting that fully implemented and operational. And then 8 to 10 years with LRT and getting it fully operational. Environmental impacts. For BRT, they're a lot lower. There's a lot less infrastructure needed when we're building out a BRT system. We need a lot more right-of-way and infrastructure when we're talking about an LRT. So there are higher potential for adverse effects for LRT with a little lower for BRT. So these are all the things that we're seeing right now from a mode comparison standpoint, just to give you an idea of the things that we're looking at and evaluating. So what are our next steps? So I kind of mentioned this early on. Our next steps right now, we are in screen one. We'll get your feedback. We'll go back and do a little bit more analysis and study and take your feedback into consideration. And then we'll begin to narrow the alternatives down to approximately three or less alternatives. And from there, we'll come back to you and give you a more detailed discussion about the few alternatives that we have left remaining. And so that we can pick one going forward with your feedback and go into finally getting a new LPA in March 2023. One thing I will point out is what we need you to do, and it's very important that you do this, is that you go and take the survey at theconnectclifton.com. We need this before August 30th. So you got a little time to go and take that. We definitely need you to do that because, again, we need your feedback. It is very important process, part of this process of selecting a new LPA. We'll come back to you in the fall. So again, be looking for a new outreach opportunity in the fall of 2022, because that's when we'll come back and talk to you about the very few alternatives that we have left to move forward. And we'll have a lot more detail from an engineering standpoint for you. And so with that, what we want to do right now is we want to get into the question and answer session to give you an opportunity to ask your questions. And I see we have a lot of people in the chat. Let's see here. Hey, Whitney, can you hear me? All right, let's see. All right, so I'm starting at the beginning here. Oh, we didn't, yeah, so we didn't, I think this was at the beginning. There was a question about who the employers were. I am a MARTA employee. So the project manager, I am a MARTA project manager, and as well as Whitney is a consultant. She works on our consultant team as part of the project team. You guys give me a second. I'm going to pull up my question document. Let's see. What is LPA? So LPA. So the question is, what is an LPA? So LPA is locally preferred alternative. That is the alternative that rises to the top from a selection standpoint that we intend to build. So MARTA right now, the locally preferred alternative. Oh, somebody answered that question, Daniel. Thank you for answering that, Daniel. I see you did answer that. But that is what the LPA is, as they stated. And MARTA board must adopt an LPA in order for it to move forward. Yeah, see, I have to commend the audience right now. You guys definitely answer some of these questions yourselves. Yeah, so BRT, LRT, yes, bus rapid transit, light rail transit. Thank you again. Okay, let's see here. I'm looking for ones that haven't been answered. Let's see. And Whitney, feel free to, you guys, if you see questions I haven't reached yet, feel free to point them out to me. And Greg as well.
Yeah, I think thanks. I'm Greg with MARTA. I think might have a little bit of a technical issue on her end, but we'll start working through the questions here. And I think most of these will be coming to you, Brian, as well as the project team,
Okay.
the AECOM. So let's start with, here's a question. Why does it take 5 to 7 years to implement a bus?
Well, that's a good question. Necessarily, and so when you think about 5 to 7 years, there's still a lot of infrastructure we have to build. So if you think about building any type of development, you have to purchase the land. That's one thing. So we're working with CSX. That's just one stakeholder that we have to work with before we can even touch the ground or get any piece of equipment or turn dirt. We have to really negotiate and get access to the land. Now, once we get access to the land, there's mobilization. Once we mobilize, then we're talking actual construction. Construction timeframes vary. Just depends on the contractor. Just depends on the weather. There's a lot of variables when you start talking about construction. And so that's why we're saying 5 to 7 years, because you never really know what'll happen during that construction period. You can run into something that could slow you down. But again, those are estimated years. But there's a lot of different processes and things that we have to do before we can even get to the point where we can turn dirt to start that process. And that in itself takes some time. NEPA takes about 2 years. And so that just gives you an idea of some of the things that we have going on before we can actually turn dirt. I'll ask anybody else on the project team if you have anything more to add to that, feel free.
All right. Thanks, Brian. I think we're going to alternate kind of between, we are logging all of the questions that are coming into the chat, but we're going to alternate between the chat and a few of the folks who have their hands raised. Forgive me, I don't think I'm able to see who raised their hand first, but let me start with Jessica Williams. I'm going to unmute you to allow you to ask your question. Thanks.
And the first question is, what is the change in ridership on MARTA pre-COVID versus today? Because what I have read is that across a lot of major cities, we've migrated to hybrid work and that far fewer people are using public transportation. So my concern as a taxpayer is that we would be adopting a plan that would be net negative. It would cost more than what we would get out of it. That's question number one. Question number two deals with the fact that a large portion of the Claremont corridor that you're proposing to use is a historic corridor. And the trees in that historic corridor are protected. If you're going to widen the road for a bus lane or for a train lane, how do you plan to adhere to the historic corridor preservation, which is non-trivial?
All right, thank you very much for that. I'll take the first one, Brian, and then
Okay.
maybe if you'd like to jump in on the second one.
Yep.
You're absolutely right. transit ridership has been challenged, I think, nationwide and worldwide from the pandemic. Generally across the board, MARTA I'm using some rough estimates, but we're probably at about anywhere from 55 to 60% of our daily ridership across both rail and bus systems since COVID. And so that's obviously something that we are concerned about in the long term, but we're continuing to see a gradual increase. I think that's something that every city in America and around the world has faced. I think that we are going to continue to see that increase come through. It's going to be a couple more years, I think, before we've seen all of that settle out and really have some good ridership forecasting. So I think we acknowledge that, and that's something that every transit system is dealing with. So with Brian, do you want to take the second part?
Yeah, so the second part, that actually falls into, because of the historic, and kind of mentioned earlier, historic area, historic resources, that does fall under NEPA. And so there are things that there's protocol that we have to go through when we talk about affecting any environmental, historic, or historical resource. So one thing from a tree canopy standpoint, from the trees, we understand the area is historical. So we have to mitigate that as much as possible, any impact. So all the impact, we have to prove and show that we can mitigate it. And so that could include planting trees elsewhere, replanting trees, and things of that nature. So you're right, we cannot get around the historical impact or the historical nature in the area. We are required to respond to the FTA with regards to how we're going to mitigate any of the impact that we intend to pursue.
Okay, just a moment. Okay, we have how will BRT compete with auto traffic with the increase of population here in DeKalb County and the need to move folks to work along the Emory Corridor?
Yeah, so along the Emory Corridor, so we are talking dedicated lanes. So it would not need to compete with the traffic because it would be in its own dedicated right of way. We would be using transit signal priority. So that also moves it a lot faster than the general public or the general traffic lanes. So it would be in its own dedicated right of way where it would not have to compete for travel space and lane with the general traffic.
Okay. All right. I'm going to go to another raised hand here. I think we've got Mr. Benjamin Kennard. And go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you for letting me speak. I'm a Emory graduate student and a transit writer in the Claremont corridor. So I'm glad that this project is, sort of kicking up again. I definitely use it whenever it gets built. That being said, I had a couple of comments that I sort of, wanted y'all to hear. So number one is when you're looking back at sort of where the end station should be for regardless of whether it's BRT or LRT, I think Avondale Station makes a lot more sense than Decatur Station. If we're looking holistically at the metro area as a whole, rather than say just like the MARTA service region, I feel like Avondale Station is much more suited to the commuters that will be using this line, which, it's mainly Emory and CDC employees, for example, right? A lot of this corridor from Emory out over to the sort of Decatur, the suburban plaza transit village is already served by Emory's Cliff shuttles, their free bus lines, right? And a lot of these commuters are from Eastern DeKalb County, from Gwinnett County, from Clayton County. And so they already commute in by car, park their cars at a park and ride lot, and then take transit in to get into the corridor, right? Now, this would still be an option if you do Avondale Station because they have parking at that station. However, that's not an option at Decatur Station, which would severely constrain the amount of commuters that are able to say, to use this transit line, because they would have to park at Avondale, possibly wait up to 15 minutes for a transit line, and then get to Decatur Station and make the transfer there. So I think Avondale would make more sense for the commuting patterns of the region. My second comment, this is my last comment, I'll be done soon, but I think, I've spoken to the both the Decatur City Council as well as the DeKalb County Commission about this, because I take the Emory shuttles to get to campus on a regular basis. I take the stop at North Decatur Road and Superior Avenue. And anybody who's been through that area knows that it's a very dangerous area for pedestrians as well as drivers. And I think part of the reason for that is that it hasn't been redone in such a long time. And when I spoke to both the Decatur City Council and the DeKalb County Commission, they sort of, talked about this rail line as being a complicating factor in redeveloping this, this intersection of North Decatur and Superior Avenue, because, this project's been kind of on ice for a long time. And to the extent that it's possible, I would highly encourage that, that this locally preferred alternative is picked soon and committed to. That way, reconstruction can happen on these intersections along North Decatur Road. Because, as a pedestrian, it really scares me to go, walking to a bus stop where I have like 3 feet separating me from a 45-mile-an-hour, busy road. Absolutely. And like an intersection that was nicknamed like Decatur's intersection of death or something like that at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
Thank you very much for those comments. I'd like to encourage everyone to make sure that you do fill out the survey, which has lots of opportunities to collect comments like these. In addition, we are logging everything that you're putting in the chat and making sure that we PA process or through the alternatives analysis process. So thank you for that. Now with that, I'm going to jump into another question from the chat here. This is a question, let's see. Give me just a moment. This is a question regarding phasing as far as the full length. Would either or both options be opened all at once, or could they be opened in stages as the systems are built out? Brian?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because many of you, as you know, you've probably seen where we were considering phasing the projects from a phase 1 and phase 2 perspective, being North Decatur Claremont being the interim terminus station. We can do either. One thing I will point out is that funding really becomes one of the key drivers there, considering that phase 1, we consider mostly within the city of Atlanta, phase 2 being mostly in DeKalb County. So right now, our funding scenarios, we're still vetting out. As you know, we do have some dedicated funding from the city of Atlanta, but we still need to find additional funding from our stakeholders, as well as utilizing funding for the federal government. The federal government will not fund the entire project. And so phase 1 could be dictated and phase 2 could be dictated by funding scenarios.
Right. And go back to the raised hand with Mr. Broussard. Go ahead and ask your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, the question was the reference Brian made to changes in the corridor and development in the interim periods since the LPA was adopted. What developments have changed that have compromised the corridor, the routes that you all were looking at, and specifically, what did Emory do something that compromised the routes? Tell us what you meant there. please.
Yeah, no. I'll correct that and make sure everyone understands. Emory has not done anything to compromise the route, nor in general, nor have many of our stakeholders. There are some, when I speak of development in the area, so there's some new developments that we may now want to touch. There's some new developments that may cause us slightly to adjust some of our alignment. But in general, none of our stakeholders at this point have done anything to preclude the current LPA. Because it's been such a long time, we just have to go back and look at the new developments in the area and the impact from a ridership standpoint, how many people are now going to be in the area, and things of that nature. But no, they have not done anything, nor have our other stakeholders done anything at this point that could preclude the current LPA.
Okay. Next up, are there plans to have dedicated lanes for either mode outside of the CSX right-of-way?
Yes, we are planning to have dedicated right-of-way along the public streets as well. In some instances, we will be looking at whether we should be taking a lane and turning it into a public, or turning it into a dedicated lane, or should we be actually adding a lane, which will require some property acquisition. So we are looking at both, but there will be dedicated lanes outside of the CSX right-of-way. That is not to say the entire route will be dedicated outside of CSX right-of-way, but as I mentioned earlier, 70% of this project has to be dedicated before we call it BRT at MARTA.
Okay. Along those same lines, we have questions about whether specifically the segment along Claremont Avenue was planned to be shared lanes, or whether there would be added right-of-way for dedicated lanes. And the same question as well for specifically for North Decatur Road.
Yeah. So we're looking at both options right now. So we are looking at operating within mixed traffic, as well as we're looking at what it looks like to take a lane. So this is part of the process. And so we want your feedback into your thoughts, because obviously if we do need to take right away and add an additional lane, that is something we need to consider and how people feel about that. If we're going to just take a lane or operate in mixed traffic, we need to understand your thoughts around that as well. But this is part of the process that we're going through. We have not finalized any of that. As we move forward, after we receive your comments, as we move forward, the next phase will have a lot more engineering detail to discuss.
Okay, and I'd also like to note that on the website, we do have documents that I think that show the images of what some of the potential guideway options could be for the different alternatives. And so we certainly encourage folks to go to connectclifton.com or cliftoncorridor.com. Will take you to the same place and review all of the materials there. Okay, let's see. Here is a question regarding road diets. For those who are not familiar with a road diet, that is kind of a nickname given to projects that reduce travel capacity on urban roads, often in the name of safety and slowing down speeds and allowing more space for enhanced streetscapes and pedestrian facilities, bike facilities, those kinds of things. There are multiple projects like that in City of Decatur in particular. They're asking, with the proposed road diets and existing road diets on streets around Decatur, Avondale, how can you possibly move BRTs through heavy auto volume? They say there is no way you're going to make your travel time goals.
Yeah, so you're right. There are a lot of road diets being planned and implemented within the area. One thing that's part of this process as we get into detailed engineering is that we'll look at those road diets and we'll decide whether we need to add a lane dedicated. Again, we are not looking to operate a system that is not efficient. So we're looking at all options with regards to making sure that we can operate efficiently. And so that does include reevaluating or rethinking what's taking place on the roadways. And so we'll have to talk with our partners, whether it's GDOT or local jurisdiction, about that and about how we can make sure that we have an efficient operating transit system. So those are things we'll look at going forward.
Okay. We have one regarding DeKalb Farmers Market. So if we look, do we mind, can we go back to one of the slides? This one is related to BRT. Can we go back to the BRT alternative slide, please?
Let me just go back this way.
Okay. All right. So this question is, can DeKalb Farmers Market be included as a stop on BRT Alternative 1? And so just to orient everyone, DeKalb Farmers Market would be located in kind of that large gray area just to the right of the Irvin Way station that's shown there.
Yeah, so yeah, we actually, the Irvin Way station was intended, kind of to at least be in the area of the DeKalb Farmers Market. So RT1, which is the red, that actually is the station location we were looking to serve DeKalb Farmers Market.
Okay. Okay. This is another question regarding congestion. Forgive me, Brian, if this kind of answers or is similar to something you've already answered, but it says there are only 3 main roads into the Emory area. Is it Houston Mills, North Decatur, and Briarcliff? With any accident on any of the 3, traffic is either stopped or severely limited for that duration and results in congestion of the other 2 routes. How will busing be successful if it is also trapped in this traffic with limited route connectivity? I guess could you get to the
Yeah, and that's something we're evaluating. Again, this all goes back to how do we implement whether it's dedicated right of way for the bus when we're talking bus and transit signal priority or bat lanes or so forth. We'll look at all of this in detail, and that's good you pointed that out. That's something we've been looking at as well. What would be our alternative to get the bus into its own dedicated right of way to get out of that traffic? So that's something we're looking at. I can't get into details yet because we're still evaluating how we're going to do that. But yes, we are considering that going forward.
Okay. Just a moment. Here's a question. How could you describe exactly how and where a BRT line would be ramped back up from the CSX line up to North Decatur? And then would there be an additional lane on North Decatur from Claremont to DeKalb Industrial? And so this question kind of refers to that bend in the alternatives, kind of between Emory Claremont and North Decatur Claremont, which I think really is going to be a challenge for all the alternatives. Brian, could you give a little bit of idea of what we're looking at there?
Yeah, that you're right. That's going to be a challenge regardless of the alternative that we choose because we're coming up out of the CSX right away, which is actually lower than most of the right of way around it that surrounds it. So obviously we're going to have an aerial structure, and how that aerial structure looks is something we'll be evaluating from an aesthetic standpoint, but it will have to be an aerial structure to get us back to ground level. I do have some of the team members on board if you want to elaborate a little more. I don't know if Agnes or Peter or someone, Sanan, you want to weigh in a little more on that?
Brian, I think you've covered it pretty well. This is Peter Voorhees. I'm a consultant with AECOM supporting MARTA on this project. But there are several alternatives for that transition between the CSX right-of-way and either of the branches at the eastern end. And these were all looked at carefully. We've had really lively discussions in the in-person sessions with community members about issues in that area. lots of considerations still to be considered that will be looked at very carefully as we go forward with the project. But there's a wide variety of alternatives to make that transition.
While we're discussing that location, and I'm trying to find the exact question right now, but we had received a question regarding what kind of buffer may exist between the corridor, regardless of the mode, and the adjacent neighborhoods. Whether it's in, I think this question is probably more relevant to the CSX corridor
Buffer.
location, but I guess anything you can offer on that.
Yeah, so I guess let me make sure I understand. So what's the buffer between the neighborhood and our tracks?
Yeah, I think what would be the kind of experience or the visual experience that a resident whose home backs up to the corridor would see from this project, regardless of whether it's BRT or LRT.
Right. Okay. There's some considerations that we will be looking at. Everything from aesthetic. Is there some sort of wall fencings of some type that you put up that provides a aesthetically pleasing view? It's the vegetation. Is there vegetation, enough vegetation built up or planted to a point where, again, the visual aspects are pleasing? We obviously will have protection. So, wall protection, barriers to make sure that there are no trespassers will be back there. So again, it is about aesthetics and how do we make that look visually pleasing. I don't know, Peter or Agnes, if you guys have any thoughts around what's been done around the country around that or not.
So one thing that I'll mention, this is Peter again, is that in the next phase of the project, we'll be narrowing from this, large set of alternatives to a smaller set for further consideration. And part of the evaluation going forward is environmental considerations. That includes potential noise impacts, potential vibration impacts, potential visual impacts, and all of those will be considered. And design options offered as potential solutions to any of those things. But that's all to be considered in next phases of the project too. We haven't gotten into that sort of detail yet.
Okay, thanks. Here's a question. Just like to note that we're up here on 12 o'clock. We did say, the meeting was probably going to be 11 to 12 o'clock, but we recognize that we have a great discussion going and a lot of questions. So we're going to continue going. We'll check in at around 12:15 and see about winding down then. So we should note also that this meeting is being recorded and will be available for viewing on MARTA's YouTube channel. So if you need to jump off now and want to come back and catch the rest of it, you're more than welcome to. So this is what would be the plan for the Lenox Road crossover, where currently the CSX line runs across a section of Lenox Road that handles regular vehicle traffic.
Yeah, so we are actually looking at the different alternatives and how we can make that crossing safer for one, and safe as we move rapid transit through. So that's something we have not nailed down exactly how that looks. It's been done across the country in other areas, but we will be looking at different technology, gate technology and so forth to ensure that the pedestrians are safe and the driving public is safe before a train or bus comes through that area. So that we'll have more detail on that crossing in the next phase.
Okay. All right. What is the difference in width between LRT, light rail lanes, and dedicated BRT lanes? And this is specifically referring to on the roads.
Right.
But I think you could answer the question for both the roads as well as the dedicated guideway in the CSX corridor.
Right. And your typical width with your 12-foot lane was we can utilize that for light rail or BRT. One thing about BRT, however, is we can actually go smaller. You likely cannot go smaller with light rail from a width perspective, but BRT, we actually can get away with the smaller lane lift, non-traditional, say 10-foot lanes instead of 12. So we can get away with the smaller footprint from a dedicated right-of-way perspective with BRT than we can with LRT. And that goes regardless of the corridor, whether it's in CSX or the public right-of-way.
And Brian, this is Peter again, and Agnes, you may want to chime in here. What we've been considering so far is really comparable widths for both BRT and LRT in the corridor. Would you say that's correct, Agnes?
Yes, that's correct. Right now, we are considering it's very comfortable with. For sure that we can see to reduce the width when we have a more certainty on the types of vehicles will be used.
So will be considered further going forward, but we're considering comparable widths for now, correct?
Correct. We are very comfortable for now.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Are there plans to consider how the new line can create more neighborhood and parks connectivity, as well as connectivity to the nearest stations? For example, how foot or bike paths could be created between Zonalite Park and Morningside Nature Park, or how dead ends nearest to new stations or ones that run up into the CSX line in nearby neighborhoods could be used to bring residents to and from the stations. So I think generally just asking about what kinds of opportunities there are for trail and bike and pedestrian connectivity along the route.
Yeah, one thing we are looking at is obtaining the right of way for at least obtaining it for bike pedestrians along the route. So looking at that right of way is something we are considering obtaining it during this process. When it comes to actually building out these connections and building out the potential to build out connections and studying them, we're actually leaning on some of the local jurisdictions as well as some of the local organizations that do this on a regular basis. So we're looking at the right of way, we look to obtain the right of way, and then we'll start to talk with all the local organizations and stakeholders about how we can make those connections.
Just to add to pedestrian connectivity plans that are being, moved forward by City of Decatur, DeKalb County, Emory University, CDC campus, South Fork Conservancy, there is a Path Foundation. All of those organizations really have some very strong kind of aspirations and projects in progress. And to whatever extent we can use those and work with them to really make better connections to our system and increase our ridership, we are very going to be very enthusiastic about that. So thanks. Okay. I'm scrolling down through the list. Just wanted to make sure we have covered everything here. We have one question here that I think is probably worth addressing, but it says, what is MARTA's preferred option, LRT or BRT, and Avondale versus Decatur? And so it might just be worth emphasizing the alternatives analysis process again. Thank you.
Yeah, so MARTA has no preferred alternatives at this point. MARTA is in the business of implementing projects that are efficient and that are viable and useful for our riding population. One thing I will say, while we have this part of the alternative analysis process, it is meant to be non-biased, and that is for a reason. It is for us to look from a holistic standpoint at all alternatives and modes. What I will say with regards to these projects is that that's one reason we look at, from a capital cost standpoint, what things cost. So while we are going to be ready from a technical standpoint, regardless of the mode and the alternative route that we select, the major thing for us then comes in from stakeholders. What do you want? And do we have the funding necessary to build what we want? I will say, from our perspective, again, we have some committed funds from the city of Atlanta. But again, regardless of the project, we're still going to need some help from our other stakeholders. And that for us, that doesn't determine whether we go with Decatur Station or Avondale as the terminus. For us, it doesn't matter. We're trying to build exactly what the public and our stakeholders want and what's the most efficient route that gets us the same results.
Follow up to that question, Brian, can we make these decisions faster?
I wish we could. I wish we can all just come together today and say, hey, we know what we want. Let's go out and build today. But it doesn't work that way, unfortunately. There are some timelines that we have to adhere to. Some we can shorten. The environmental work we likely can shorten because we're now within CSXs, considering CSXs right away. If we come to an agreement with them, that could shorten the environmental timeframe.
Just to clarify that, by what you mean is that we shorten the amount of area that we have to do environmental review on. Not that skipping any of it, but that we won't have to do as much for that portion.
Right. For that particular, right. Typically, there's a process where there's a 2-year process, and then there's also some shortened 1-year processes as well. So we can shorten that time frame depending on if we can come to an agreement with CSX because it's in a rail corridor. So some of these things can move quicker. Some may take longer, but we will do everything in our power to make this a lot quicker, as fast as possible.
Okay. And we are going to keep going to 12:15 here. So we got 5 more minutes. We're just going to continue to run through a few more questions. Let's see here. I can't quite understand this question. I guess it's if we went forward with the Avondale alternative for the eastern terminus, is it possible? What are the connection points to Decatur? Because there are riders, lower income residents, and other facilities at the Decatur terminus. How would we serve them if we went to Avondale?
Yeah, so from a hypothetical standpoint, if we went to Avondale, there is an opportunity to serve Decatur. We've also thought about, if it's BRT and not light rail, which is permanent, even with light rail, however, we could implement some ART, which is arterial rapid transit. Arterial rapid transit, it's not our regular bus service, but it's also not BRT, it's in between. That is a much faster service that could serve that area, Decatur area. And we got to remember, we still do have the heavy rail station where we can branch out from there as well. So there's some opportunity if we were to select Avondale to still serve the area down Claremont Avenue and Scott Boulevard with potential arterial rapid transit options.
Okay. And as far as you mentioned heavy rail connection, obviously, could we go into a little bit more detail just about how that experience will be for a customer on the new line as far as making that transfer to and from our existing heavy rail system?
Yeah, the intent there is to be as seamless as possible. It'd be typical to your current transfer opportunities where you don't have to buy another fare. Essentially, it's a transfer. We're looking at off-board fare collection. So that is one important thing when you start talking about the new lines that we're implementing, the way you pay. So validators getting onto the train or bus, being able to validate your ticket, and then being able to transfer over directly into the heavy rail system. We anticipate operating similarly with the transfers.
Okay. This is a question specific to a certain street. I think I may be saying this wrong, but Medeiros Drive, which is a small street that's kind of off of Claremont, I think, kind of near the YMCA. And they are asking, have you done traffic studies along Medeiros to see the impact of either of the alternatives along there? And just how Medeiros would be used in the options that use that street.
Yeah, we're actually starting traffic studies now. One thing about traffic studies, you want to typically do them at the peak time. So when school's in, to get a true evaluation of it. And we're coming out of the summer, school's getting ready to start. So we'll be doing traffic studies now to evaluate that more in detail.
All right. So with that, we are coming up on 12:15. We would like to encourage everyone to make sure that you do go fill out the survey. There's a link to the survey at the website that is connectclifton.com or cliftoncorridor.com, either one. There is space for, it talks through several questions about what some of your priorities are for this project, including some questions about the proposed modes, as well as the alternatives of Decatur versus Avondale. There are also spaces there for you to make any of the comments. We are going to be logging all of the comments that you've made in the chat, but if you'd like to reinforce it, we certainly appreciate you going ahead and putting that in your survey response. We'd also like to emphasize that if you have questions about the project, any kind of technical things, anything that you feel that we did not address yet, or something that you don't feel would be addressed by a comment in the survey, please email clifton@itsmarta.com. And that's something that will go to the entire project team. And we generally will acknowledge the receipt of your question within a day or two, and then ask for a few more days to get you a detailed response. So with that, I'd like to give the rest of the team an opportunity to jump in with anything else I may have missed. We'd also like to emphasize, actually, can you jump to the last slide, Brian, with the events?
Yeah, let's do that. There.
Okay, so this is the third of 4 engagement events that we've been doing for this round. You're going to continue to see us out in the community for the next few weeks, really trying to drive responses to the survey. The closing date for the survey for this round of comments is going to be Tuesday, August 30th. So we've got plenty of time, more than a month, to circulate. We really want to have as many responses as possible. If you have any questions that would help inform your response to the survey, please email clifton@itsmarta.com. and we'll be sure to get that to you. So you'll continue to see us out in the community with some pop-ups in the stations. We are also, I think, talking about a couple of smaller briefings with some of the neighborhood organizations. So just you'll continue to hear much more about this. The next virtual meeting, which will be the same content as you saw today, will be tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. for those who weren't able to make a weekday engagement. So please feel free to pass that along. Or if you'd like to join us again, we would love to have you. So with that, I think we will wrap up. I'd like to say thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. And we look forward to continuing to engage with all of the community, all of our stakeholders as we move forward in building this project. Brian, anything more?
I think that's it. Thank you, everyone. And we look forward to the continued coordination and your feedback. Have a good day, everyone.
All right.